Hi guys, in this video I want to go over an article that came out today, July 13th, and it's regarding the federal government deficit. So, the federal government spends a lot of money, obviously, and in order to spend money, they got to get money. So they do that through taxation. But the federal government likes to spend more than they get in taxes. So the difference between what they spend and what they collect in taxes is called the budget deficit. And these numbers come out for us every month, so we can kind of track just how much of a deficit they are running. Based on the data that came out today, for the past 12 months, ending in June of this year, the government ran a deficit of over $3 trillion. Now, that is a very large number, and I'll show you that in the context of a graph in a minute. But before we do that, understand that in order for the federal government to spend more money than it brings in taxes, it has to borrow that money. So when we say there's a budget deficit of over $3 trillion, we essentially mean that the federal government borrowed $3 trillion in money in the past 12 months. And $1 trillion is a big number, but we also have a big economy. So oftentimes we like to think of the budget deficit in terms of percentages of our economy rather than in terms of dollar values. And if you do that, you'll find that as a share of GDP, the deficit is on pace to be the largest since World War II. Let me show you some numbers. Scroll down here. This chart here shows the deficit. This is from the Treasury. Okay, that's the organization that manages the government's finances. And it shows the U.S. budget deficit over a 12-month period as a share of gross domestic product. And remember, gross domestic product is total output in our economy. So the most recent number puts it at, let's see, for June, 13.8, almost 14% of our total economy was borrowed by the federal government in the past 12 months. Almost 14% of our entire economy was the amount more that the government spent than what they brought in taxes. So either way you want to look at it, 14%. Now, how does that compare? Well, let's go back. Well, the last significant number was back in December of 2009. That was around the depths of the Great Recession, and we were at just 10% in comparison. Okay, then you can go back to another period, 1992, 5%, and then back in 83. The point is, in percentage terms, we have a larger deficit than we've seen in decades. Now, if you want to look at the actual numbers, here's Trading Economics, and this shows the U.S. budget deficit in dollar values per month. Okay, so for example, in the month of June here, we ran a deficit, that's why it's below zero, of around $864 billion, so just under $1 trillion in that month. But if you add all these monthly deficits up, okay, and we had a little surplus here back in 2019, but if you add all these up, you're going to get that year-over-year deficit of around $3 trillion. And you can look back at the raw numbers historically. If we go back 5 years or 10 years, let's go back 25 years. And again, you're seeing numbers that stand out. We do max. This goes all the way back to the 50s, and you'll notice that in dollar terms, again, we're seeing extremes here. So just another example of the kind of aberrant time that we're in right now, and another metric that's reflecting that aberration. Okay, so why would this be? Why are we running such large deficits? Well, when you think about the recent events, on the one hand, because we're in a recession, the amount of taxes that the government is collecting is shrinking, right? Because taxes are assessed on income, but incomes are going down. People have lost their jobs or are losing their jobs. Businesses are shut down, so they're not collecting profits. A lot of economic activity has been stifled, and that has caused income to be reduced, which has caused taxes for the federal government to be reduced. So you can imagine that the federal government has less to work with in terms of taxes. But at the same time, because of the current situation, the government is ramping up spending. I mean, they're sending out all these unemployment checks to people. That's expensive. A lot of people are going to qualify for anti-poverty programs. That costs the federal government money, so there's another expense. And in addition, they're doing all these stimulus packages, things like sending checks to every household, right? Emergency loans. A lot of businesses that are struggling are getting money from the federal government. On top of that, the federal government has extended the tax deadline. Normally, taxes are due April 15th, but they extended it to July 15th. So they haven't really collected taxes for 2019 yet. That combination of decreased tax revenue and increased spending is creating these large deficits, which is then causing the government to have to borrow a lot of money. Now, it's important to understand, though, that when we borrow money, we have to pay interest on that. Let me take you to this site here. This is the U.S. debt clock. And if you're not familiar with this site, you will be, because we have a discussion board that will use this site. But it's very helpful because it quickly tells you not only some important numbers about the government, but it also tells you the source. And this data comes directly from the government. So it's, for example, the national debt, okay, U.S. total debt, all these numbers. So you can check out a lot of them, but I want to point you to a couple real quick. First off, notice that U.S. federal spending actual, about $6.3 trillion. Okay, so that's the spending that's been going on for the last year. And then if you look at U.S. federal tax revenue, it's about $2.5 trillion. So that's the amount of money they're collecting. Well, the difference between these two is going to be the federal budget deficit. Okay, it may not be perfectly down to the decimal, but it's close. And that's the number that we're talking about in this article. So in effect, the federal government has spent $3.7 trillion more over the past year than it brought in taxes. Okay, we want this spending, we only collect this much in taxes. That's the difference. That then becomes borrowed money, right? Because they got to get that from somewhere. So they go out and they borrow it. And they do this by issuing what are called treasuries. And those treasuries add up to the U.S. national debt. So running deficits increases the national debt. And the national debt is something we have to watch closely because it does represent, like any debt, a potential future burden. I mean, if you have no debt, then you feel a lot more optimistic about your financial future than if you have a lot of debt. It's no different for the federal government. If we have a lot of debt, then we have to deal with that in the future. And that usually means that at some point we're going to see higher taxes or less government spending or both, which are going to affect certain people in a adverse way. But that's the trade-off, and trade-offs are always present. Right now, given the circumstances of COVID-19, a recession, the government has decided that it's better to spend a lot of money accumulating deficits and debt, and then postpone really dealing with the national debt for a later time, maybe during more prosperous times, where if they can raise taxes, lower spending, run surpluses, and actually bring down that national debt. But for now, deficits and debt are likely the norm for the foreseeable future. All right, that's it, guys. If you have questions about this, please let me know. Thanks.